living La Vida low carb. This show is changing lives. We talking about your diet, trying to get you feeling right. Cut up them avocados, fry some eggs. Time to explore the longest running health podcast, hosted by Jimmy Moore. Time to give up the crappy garbage. We're getting into ketosis. Every day is a new step to your goal. Yeah, you're getting closer, motivated and focused. Don't stop, just go. Time to get inspiration from the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. Hey, the livinglowcarbshow.com.
Sam Apple is his name, you guys. Go follow him at Sam Apple Books over on Instagram. He is the author of a brand new book called Ravenous, all about the story of Otto Warburg, the cancer diet connection. So much in this book. Really, go get this book, available wherever books are sold, Amazon, all the places. So thank you so much for being here today, Sam. You are at Johns Hopkins, and you are a writer at many publications I mentioned earlier before you came on the show. So why don't you tell us a little bit of how you got interested in what you do at Johns Hopkins, and then how did it lead you to the work of Otto Warburg?
Sure. I started my career as a sort of general interest journalist. I wasn't in science writing initially, but over the years, I've sort of allowed my curiosities to lead me into different journalistic projects, and I found I became more and more interested in science just from my own reading, really. And I was very influenced by Gary Taubes in particular. So many of us in the sort of low carb community were. So I was interested in it, but still writing mostly about other topics and, doing the science piece now and then. But I really became interested in writing about cancer and Otto Warburg when I learned that cancer was associated with the, other metabolic diseases that we think of as metabolic diseases. I never thought of cancer as a metabolic disease. So that was a real turning point for me.
Yes, it was Tom Seyfried that really put that on the map with his work in the late 2000s. I know you know all about him, but maybe the people in the audience don't. I remember interviewing him when he came out with the Cancer as a Metabolic Disease book. It was like $129 on Amazon because it was like a tech. Yeah. And I'm actually mentioned in that book because we had previous to that, and he talked about if you want to avoid cancer, once a year, do a 7 to 10 day distilled water only fast was his kind of recipe, and based a lot on his own research and people like Otto Warburg kind of proving that concept of this connection. And so, so it's been out there a little while, but it's good to kind of re-emphasize things that haven't gotten enough attention. Right.
And, Seyfried, I think, deserves a lot of credit for bringing metabolism back onto the map. It's kind of ironic in a way that I think that, there's within the cancer metabolism world, there's a lot of debates about how exactly cancer starts. And Seyfried is actually what I like to call a true Warburgian. He thinks Otto Warburg really has the whole story right.
Yes.
I agree with him on a lot of things about metabolism. I'm actually a little more skeptical of some of Warburg's theories than he is, which was actually frustrating for me as a researcher, because it'd be an easier story to tell if I bought everything that Warburg said. But
I want to get in.
I mostly agree, and what we both agree on, and I certainly feel strongly, is that cancer should be understood as much as a genetic disease. It's also a metabolic disease, and that you can't understand it without understanding the metabolic aspect.
It can be both, and that's the thing. People think it's this either or. Oh, it must be genetic. Oh, it must be metabolism. And I'm thinking it could be both. Like, there's elements of both, and I want to get into that in a minute, get more deep into that. But keep going.
Yeah, so I was interested, how could it be that cancer is a part of the story? In a way, it makes sense to me that obesity and diabetes are metabolic. I mean, it's self-evident, but cancer, I had thought, was, a separate realm. You get an unlucky mutation, or you get exposure to radiation or whatnot. So when I saw that cancer, arose in the 19th century at the same time as the diabetes epidemic, and then sort of grew in lockstep with these other metabolic conditions, that really piqued my curiosity. But, as a science writer and a journalist and a storyteller, I'm always looking for how I'm going to tell a story. was really, when I learned about Warburg, I came across just one or two sentences in a piece that said, in 1923, a German scientist had made this discovery. I didn't know anything about it, but I Googled him and started to read about his life. And that's when I thought, oh, this is how I'm going to tell the story. This fascinating man is going to allow me to go into the science and really combine all of my interests, because I'm interested in history. I'm interested in studies about the Holocaust. And, my first book was about the Holocaust. And so, suddenly I had a story that combined all of my interests.
You know what I love about you science writers, Gary, definitely this way, because I think he was into cold fusion before he was the low carb message. But it's like you go for kind of the jugular of some controversy and go, okay, why is that controversial? And I remember that was where Gary came into the low carb space, and he started, why is saturated fat vilified? Why do we do that? Like, I love just the inquisitiveness that comes from doing what you do. It makes you a good journalist, by the way, that you question authority. It seems to be out of style these days to question authority on anything. You just go along to get along. But you chose to look into this further. And kudos to you looking up Otto Warburg. I think he is one of the most deserving heroes in kind of nutritional health and health in general that nobody ever talks about, even though he won the Nobel Prize for something, the diet and a chronic disease that we still deal with to this day. It's just amazing how it's so forgotten.
Yeah, no, that was one of the most shocking parts for me of the whole story, is how quickly he was forgotten. Part of it was that, the main reason is that, people became interested in genetics and, cancer mutations, oncogenes, and metabolism was just, thrown out. Everybody lost interest in it. It also had to do, though, I think, with, Warburg's story in the war, and people were skeptical of him. Why did this guy survive? Why did he stay in Nazi Germany? So a lot of scientists didn't want to have anything to do with him. So even though he made this very fundamental discovery, and whatever you think about the interpretation of the discovery, everybody knows the discovery itself is true, which is that, a significant percentage of cancer cells take up a lot of glucose and ferment it. So this is this very fundamental thing, and it was just completely lost, not in textbooks, not in famous cancer papers. And it's incredible because even at the same time that it was lost, doctors were starting to diagnose cancer by PET scans, which literally just shows where glucose is being taken up in the body.
Right.
So, it was in a way staring everybody in the face, and yet nobody was talking about it until, there were a few people like Siegfried and a few others that sort of kept it alive, but the mainstream science world really didn't rediscover it until the late 90s.
Well, and I'm shocked by how many oncologists in the 21st century, they just deny it. They know Otto Warburg, they know of it, but like there's no credence given to it because, and it's like everything else in medicine and health, well, we have a standard of care of how we do things, and that just diet doesn't really come into play when it comes to the standard of care for cancer. Now, I get it. Not everybody responds well. Even the very small studies that have been done by people like Eugene Fine did a nice study of about 10 people with cancer, and they showed moderate improvement amongst like a certain percentage of them. Because it's not so widespread, they don't really promote it as anything. But I mean, even if there's an inkling, it's kind of like those people who have epilepsy. Not everybody responds well to drug-resistant epilepsy with a ketogenic diet, but the ones who do. And so why don't we want to look at the same way cancer, the ones who do well, do it with them? It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, I should say that, in my book, I mostly focus on prevention rather than treatment because, to me, that's the most exciting aspect of this is the potential for prevention. But, in terms of the treatment, it's very early stages. It does look like, if the ketogenic diet or other metabolic therapies will be really useful, it'll be in conjunction with other therapies and make that, making other therapies more effective. But I do think it's certainly true that, based on the early, data that we have, if this were a pill, something that came out of Big Pharma, there would be extraordinary excitement. But because it's diet related, it just doesn't get the same kind of funding, the same kind of interest. So that's very frustrating for me. But I'm optimistic that things are starting to change. Science Magazine just did a big article about diet and cancer therapy, and that is as mainstream as it gets. But in the meantime, I'm really focused on talking about prevention and specifically how the diet that lowers insulin might help prevent cancer.
And this is the biggie, Sam, and I'm so glad. Again, you guys, if you joined late, Ravenous is the name of the book we're talking about. That is Sam Apple. He's the author of this book. Really nice book, all about Otto Warburg and his contribution to science, which we still are living through today. The principles he talked about are still applicable today. And you just nailed it. Like literally every chronic disease, not just cancer, but you could go down the list. Every chronic disease, from heart disease to diabetes to obesity, we could name them all here, Sam. They're all related to metabolism, and its ultimate kind of master hormone is insulin. And you've got a whole chapter in there just talking about insulin and why it's so important. And I think the game changer in this discussion is when we'll be able to test insulin at home, because we can test blood sugar out the wazoo at home and other little cardiometabolic health markers. But when we can test insulin at home, that's going to change the game.
Yeah, no, I agree, because, as you well know, that you can have a very normal glucose reading and still have elevated insulin for years. And, that's really, the key is to know when that's happening and to be able to address it, sooner rather than 20 years later.
Yes. So earlier you talked about you're not a Seyfried, where you buy everything that Otto Warburg talked about in his work at face value. Talk about the things you agree, and then I really am interested in kind of getting into hashing out some of the things you don't agree with.
Sure. Well, I should say that I don't want to put words into Seyfried's mouth. I'm not an expert in his research, but I'll do my best to characterize it.
I know his. I'll correct anything I know that's wrong. So.
Okay. I like to say that we're both focused on metabolism, or cancer as a metabolic disease.
Yes.
When he talks about cancer as a metabolic disease, he's very focused on the mitochondria and
right.
belief, which Warburg also had, that cancer begins when the mitochondria start to have problems and can't get enough energy through using oxygen, and then fermentation arises kind of like a backup generator to replace the energy that's lost through respiration. And that's very much Warburg's model, and I certainly agree that in the path to cancer, mitochondria are involved, and that as cancer progresses, they do tend to, cancers lack oxygen and do tend to ferment more to make up that energy. And in some cancers, I think, Seyfried may have it exactly right. But when I talk about cancer as a metabolic disease, I'm less focused on that aspect of the story than I am on insulin resistance and how cancer relates to obesity and diabetes.
Yes.
So, they're both part of the metabolism story. He's more focused inside the cell, and I'm more focused on whole body metabolism and how that affects.
Well, and both are important, and I agree with you. There is kind of a teasing out of what matters. I think your approach certainly matters, because the insulin resistance starts happening decades before it manifests as cancer. And so it doesn't just suddenly come on. This is the funny thing about all chronic disease, Sam, is, I just got diagnosed with diabetes. No, you really had diabetes years ago. It's just now manifesting as the disease state from a clinical standpoint, but it was slowly trickulating up to that. Same with heart disease, same with cancer, same with Alzheimer's. None of these are inevitabilities that just pop up overnight. You could catch them early enough, and the catch is your insulin.
Real Good Foods is one of the fastest growing frozen food companies in the U.S. Everything they make is nutrient dense, high in protein, low in carbs, and made from real food ingredients. Instead of using processed flours, everything they make is 100% grain-free and gluten-free, which is how they keep their carbs so low. They can be found at Costco, Walmart, Target, Kroger, and in almost every grocery store nationwide. Or you can order online. Check us out today at realgoodfoods.com and at Real Good Foods on social media.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't know that Seyfried would disagree with anything that I focus on so much as just he's focused on a different part of the story. But
well, and he's a little nerdy when it comes to that subject too. So it's kind of fun to tease out the DNA aspect of it and the AGE formation and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I should add too that he's a scientist and I'm a journalist, so I don't want to put myself on the same level as him. I'm just telling stories about what other people are actually doing. But because I was so focused on the insulin, the scientist that I focused on most was probably Lewis Cantley, who's at Weill Cornell, and he's the scientist who really made the connection between insulin and what takes place inside the cancer cell. He had been studying this pathway inside the cancer cell called the PI3K pathway or the PI3K-AKT pathway, and we knew, he discovered that these pathways are activated in cancer. And what he found out is that all these pathways that are activated in cancer, the famous oncogenes, are actually turned on by insulin. So you could imagine that, the pathway is flipped on and becomes overactive by a mutation, or it becomes overactive because it's being pounded with insulin signals all the time. And it looks like both are involved in cancer.
Yeah.
So, the real takeaway from that research was, an understanding of how hyperinsulinemia and constant insulin signaling, insulin at 50 times the level that it would normally be in the body, is turning on these pathways. And sure enough, these pathways that are responsible for insulin, when they started to sequence tumors, they found these are the ones that are most commonly mutated. So, and cancer cells are covered in insulin receptors. So when the microscopic cancer cell learns to take advantage of all that insulin in the environment, that to me, I think is really, at the heart of the cancer story. And it would also explain why obesity is so linked to cancer. A lot of people think that obesity causes cancer. In the model that I look at, certainly the inflammation and other hormones don't help, but I think it's the insulin driving the obesity and the cancer at the same time.
Well, look at all the little things that are like interrelated. So the rise in insulin then can cause obesity and lead to the insulin resistance, which then leads to all these chronic diseases. And so when you kind of go back in the chain of events that led to the ultimate disease, like cancer, you could find something along the way and you miss the starting point. We need patient zero and the patient zero is insulin.
Yeah. And it occurred to me that, part of the reason I wanted to focus on the history is you see that part of the reason we don't focus more on insulin is simply that, it could only be measured in the body in the late 60s, around 1970. So by the time that insulin really comes onto the scene, we already have 100 years of research, modern cancer research. We already have, the emergence of the genetic model of cancer. So, it takes a long time for a paradigm to shift. Insulin was thought of as a diabetes story, not a cancer story. And to this day, it's hard for doctors, I think, to make that mental shift.
Well, and think about from a patient perspective, which is my heart as an empowered patient trying to help other people understand. When you hear insulin, you're like, oh, that's a diabetes thing. And it's just immediately dismissed. And I always try to remind people, you didn't just, form diabetes. And it's not just about diabetes. And it's not that you need no insulin because you'd be dead if you had no insulin. So we need a better patient education, which is something I try to do through my work. But we need a lot more people like me and others that are trying to promote this for people to understand. It doesn't matter if you have diabetes or not. You need to know about insulin.
Yeah. The way I sometimes think of it is, maybe this is an oversimplification, but if you imagine an alien coming onto Earth and knowing nothing about cancer, and you say, what is cancer? He says, well, it's a problem of cells sort of growing according to their own will, with, outside of the body regulation. So what would be the first question you ask? Okay, well, what makes a cell grow? That would probably be one of the first questions. You say, well, there are hormones, and this hormone insulin is can be a growth factor. So you would start to think about, this is something I want to look into. And yet, the fact that it was ignored for so long and not taken seriously as a hypothesis is what's amazing to me, because it's just sort of a common sense deduction that if you're studying a problem of growth and insulin tells cells to take up glucose and grow, you would want to, investigate that hypothesis. And what's really interesting to me is that, other hormones, sex hormones have been understood to relate to cancer, and there isn't as much resistance, I think, to that. And I think it's because insulin connects to diet, and there's so much skepticism about diet that it's distracted. I feel like there's more resistance to thinking about insulin than with respect to estrogen or androgen. So it's very frustrating because it's really staring us all in the face.
Which is amazing to me, because all the other hormones are directly impacted by the master hormone, insulin. If it's the master, it's like the president of your body. So it kind of regulates and determines how the insulin goes is how the rest of all your endocrine pathways in your body goes. And people, the fact they don't get that means we have let people down. This should be basic education in grade school. No, I certainly agree. And, part of the problem also is that, you have all these studies done by epidemiologists who are studying cancer populations, and they make the connection between obesity and cancer, or hyperinsulinemia and cancer. And then you have guys that are working in the lab who are studying, the pathways that are turned on by insulin in the cancer cell. And yet they're two separate worlds. They're in different silos, and they don't really communicate necessarily. And that's part of my project in this book, is trying to bring those worlds together. Dude, you were talking my language, because I, for the longest time, have been observing all these fields of science and research, and I'm going, look, this field over here and this field over here, they're talking about two different end outcomes and two different things they're looking at, but they're coming to the same conclusion. Why can't meta-analysis of all these different studies and how they're coming to the same conclusion with different disease states? I think that proves the point that insulin resistance is the central factor in all of them. I think you're right. And that's what, I'm not a scientist, I'm a journalist, but I feel like what I can do is try to connect the dots, to connect those stories. And so that's what I've tried to do. But you have to really, I think, start in the 19th century. And I learned this from Taubes as well, because that's when the story begins, when all these diseases, were rare or almost non-existent in some cases, and then just grow more and more common. And, that was one of the most astonishing things for me, is reading about the 19th century and seeing how much more common cancer became, and how in some societies that weren't eating like we eat in the Western world actually remained relatively, cancer-free. I wouldn't say cancer-free, but cancer remained very rare well into the 20th century. So, it's a cause for optimism in a way, that it doesn't have to be this way, that you could imagine a world. You don't have to imagine the world. We know these worlds and societies existed where cancer was much, much less common. And I think through diet, we could get back there. Well, and look at the work of people like Dr. Weston A. Price, a dentist of all people. And he was going to these indigenous tribes and seeing their health apart from the westernized culture with food. And they were, great teeth, they were robust and everything, free of disease. And then once westernized foods became introduced, processed carbohydrates primarily, things that would boost insulin very quickly, their health went to pot. And so that's the amazing thing about all this, Sam, is none of this is new. And yet you see people go down to the grocery store, you see them go to McDonald's, you see them go to all these places willingly putting this stuff in their mouth, all at the holy altar of, well, it tastes good, not realizing that it's going to lead them 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now to developing things like Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes, heart disease.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, we should add that, not some cancers just are bad luck, and some are genetic. So it's not all, but I do think that, it's a significant percentage. And, it's what you say is true. I don't, my perspective on it, and maybe yours as well, is, I don't blame the people that go in and buy this stuff. Maybe in some cases they blame, but it's the whole culture, it's the information they're getting. It's, if I hadn't, happened to stumble across an article, that interested me and then read about Gary, I would be doing the same thing. I used to eat sugar constantly.
Yeah, dude, I was the king of carbs back in the day. Before I had Dr. Atkins' New Diet Revolution, I got it as a Christmas present in 2003, and it totally changed my life. 2003, totally radically changed my life. I did it in 2004, and I was drinking, this is no lie, Sam, I was drinking 16 cans, 12-ounce cans of Coca-Cola a day.
Oh my God.
Whole boxes of Little Debbie snack cake. I'd go to Taco Bell. I'd go to McDonald's. I'd go to 7-Eleven. I was a junk food junkie. So I was totally oblivious to it because I just didn't know any better. And I got frustrated by the eat less, move more, the eat less calories, eat low fat, because that's not satisfying, because the hormones are out of control still. Yeah. And it wasn't until I read this book that said, do the opposite of everything you've been told to do is healthy, and you're going to get healthy. And I got healthy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was really the same way. I used to get a box of Entenmann's donuts and polish it off in one day.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important part of the story, too, because when people see me, they think, oh, you're skinny, you've always been skinny, this isn't relevant for you. But in fact, I was in my late 20s and 30s, or, certainly in early 30s, I had all the signs of metabolic syndrome, or early stage metabolic syndrome. And, I carried my weight in different ways, but I was, about 20 pounds or more heavier. I had high triglycerides.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's counterintuitive, but some of the ability to store fat subcutaneously is actually protected. In my family, you get diabetes right away. We don't store fat.
Right. Well, I remember interviewing somebody once, Sam, that said, if you get obese, be lucky, because at least that adipose tissue in your midsection is actually protecting you from getting the disease while you're still growing fat cells. Oh, it was Amy Berger that said that. While you're still growing fat cells, that's your body saying, all right, bruh, we're trying to protect you from getting diabetes, or heart disease or cancer or something. But if you keep this up, we're going to tap out and we're going to have to give you the disease. So people think the obesity leads to the disease. No, the obesity is protecting you from getting the ramifications of the disease that's already developing.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. As I've understood it, the subcutaneous fat, particularly when you're able to keep adding new adipose tissue, new cells, is protected. And then when you essentially run out of that space, that, safer storage space, then you start to get this visceral fat. It starts to accumulate.
Yes.
You start to actually have fat inside of the cells, which, seems to be blocking the insulin. And then you get this vicious cycle. The insulin goes up, more fat, is stored, and so on. You know the story. But, I think it's so important for thinner people, or people that are not obviously obese, to understand that they may well have insulin resistance as well. This is everybody.
Well, the whole TOFI effect, thin outside, fat inside, and fat not meaning literal fat, but fat from a metabolic standpoint, all those things you were talking about, high triglycerides, high insulin, high inflammation levels. I could go down the list of all the things that show you're metabolically unhealthy, even though on the outside you appear thin. And so people think their thinness protects them. And I worry about those people, by the way, because society judges fat on the outside, but they never body that's metabolically sick on the inside just as much as a fat person would be, and yet because they're thin, they're protected from the criticism, and they're the ones most at risk.
No, I think my family is a perfect example of that. My grandfather died of diabetes at a relatively young age. My father is thin but had pre-diabetes, and as you said, that you see these plagues of diabetes spreading across the world. In India and China, you have a lot of people that just store fat differently, that don't look obese, and it's all the same story.
Have you guys tried the Paleo Valley beef sticks? These beef sticks are 100% grass-fed and grass-finished. And many of the grass-fed beef sticks on the market today are actually finished with grains. They use beef sourced from small domestic farms in the United States. They only use real organic spices to flavor the beef sticks versus all the conventional spices sprayed with pesticides and other natural flavors from GMO. They also ferment the sticks, which creates naturally occurring probiotics, all great for your gut health. And best of all, they taste amazing. Again, they're Paleo Valley, my favorite beef stick on the market today. Go check them out, you guys.
PaleoValley.com.
Use the coupon code Jimmy at checkout for 15% off your first order. Paleo Valley beef sticks.
Yeah. By the way, thank you for putting Otto Warburg's name back on the map, but you brought somebody else's name back out, and you mentioned his work, Pure White and Deadly. John Yudkin. Oh my gosh. Otto Warburg and John Yudkin, two of the most devalued scientists, and what they put Yudkin through in the early 70s, right as insulin was kind of coming on the scene, right as the low-fat diet was working its way into McGovern's head and wanting to put it into the dietary guidelines for Americans that would come in the early 80s. I was a kid in the early 80s, so I remember having to memorize that stupid food pyramid. We have to have 6 to 12 grains. And so, yeah, dude, John Yudkin, man, posthumously he's getting his due, but dang, at the time they pretty much said, yeah, you don't fit our mold, you don't fit our narrative, go away.
Yeah, I'm so glad. I mean, I wish he had lived longer to see his redemption. He clearly got so much right and suffered so much for getting it right. It's very frustrating. I mean, Warburg was, I think he's a hero in a lot of ways, but he wasn't a very nice guy. But, so sometimes I feel less bad, because he was an egomaniac. He would have loved his redemption, but Yudkin, I get the sense that it was a very nice guy, and I feel so bad that he was treated so badly at the end of his career. And it was also interesting for me, in a way, my book is a synthesis or an attempt at synthesizing the history and a lot of this Nazi stuff and the research. So I realized at some point that Yudkin, he called sugar pure, white, and deadly, and he had a lot of family that was affected by the Holocaust. It occurred to me that maybe that connection was in his head, that he called it pure, white, and deadly because he was aware of kind of extremist, Nazi ideology. That's just speculation, but it was just interesting to me.
Yeah.
It would have been a good title for my book as well.
Did Yudkin have any connection at all to Warburg's work that you know of in your research?
No, I don't think so. But what I did discover, and it was really kind of an interesting, surprising discovery for me, is I assumed that Warburg never had a chance to even entertain the insulin hypothesis because he died in 1970, and there was almost no talk of insulin and cancer at that point because you couldn't even. They were just learning how to measure insulin in the blood at that point. But sure enough, I found that one of Warburg's colleagues, Dean Burke, had been one of the very first to make an insulin cancer connection. And I found all these old letters that I actually found in some guy's attic in Washington, D.C. And Burke had been telling Warburg, we think insulin is a part of this, and it doesn't disprove your theory. On the contrary, it explains it. Warburg had shown that cancer cells overeat glucose. Insulin tells cancer cells to take up glucose. You would think there would be a connection. So Dean Burke is telling Warburg this in letters, and Warburg, he didn't want to hear it. He was already so fixated on his view, and it was really too soon to know. So I don't blame Warburg for not fully embracing it. But Warburg, was not somebody who updated his ideas. Once he had a theory, he stuck with it.
Well, and I think there's merit to, once you have an idea, kind of sticking with it. But if new science shows that there are prospects for your work being applied in an advanced way, it makes sense. As a scientist, you would go that route. Kind of like Bracken was just like Warburg, by the way. I remember Gary Taubes telling me the story about how when he met Atkins and, it wasn't Gary, it was Eric Westman, who did the very first Atkins study in the late 90s, like 97, 98. And he went to the clinic in New York City, and he said, "Dr. Atkins, this is fascinating what you found here. I should do a study looking at like your patients." And then he's like, "I don't need a study; it just works." So
Yeah.
but if you take it seriously in the scientific world, you kind of need the research to back you up, and I can help you with that. And he's like, "I just need X amount of money." And Atkins was like, "I don't understand why I have to pay for that, blah, blah, blah." But finally, the office said, "Dr. Atkins, please do this because we need this to get out there." And that's how the whole low-carb ketogenic research explosion of the 2000s began. Was Eric Westman went to the curmudgeon Dr. Atkins because he was not quite like Otto Warburg, but he was eccentric. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
And he's like, "I don't need to prove it; it just works." Okay, but the scientific world needs a little more than that, Dr. Atkins.
Yeah. It does sound a lot like Warburg.
Yeah.
You know, Warburg spoke at a conference in 1950 of Nobel laureates. He presented his cancer research. He said, "This is," he put up like one or two little charts and said, "This is all you need to know about cancer. The rest is garbage." And on the one hand, it's clearly a weakness as a scientist to be overconfident in that way. But I do think that it also helps explain why he made so many incredible discoveries. That tremendous self-belief and willingness to do brave experiments. That was his great strength, but also proved to be a weakness at the end of his career when he couldn't entertain any other hypotheses, even if they weren't. If they veered from his idea even a little, he rejected it.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's not science. Science goes with changes in science, and when new data presents itself that counters some of your hypotheses, you have to at least entertain them. That's kind of the problem of what's happening in modern society is new science is coming along showing things that goes against the narrative, and yet and I just did a read of a study the other day, or a paper that was published from a scientist. She published a study in 2005, 1 year after kind of a group from Harvard had come out with this. Well, 15+% of the population is obese. That's the statistic. And then this new study came out a year later, said, no, it's less than 5%. They used newer data. They updated some of the methodology about how they compared it with smoking and da-da-da. And then they proceeded to vilify this scientist because she dared to go against the narrative. They were trying to get more funding for obesity research, which, okay, fair enough, but don't lie. Don't make it not what it is. You have to be honest with the science or people don't trust science anymore. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And what's so interesting is that I sense that everything we're saying Warburg would have agreed with, and he called out other scientists for doing, getting ahead of their experiments. But when it came to his own research, he had a blind spot, and that's so often the case. And I do think it's incumbent upon all of us, who are interested in metabolism and diet to be, aware of this phenomenon and not to make, the same mistakes that we're criticizing others for. I did, I think about this because in the course of writing my book, when I started to write it, my real focus was on a relationship between sugar and cancer, but always through the role of sugar causing insulin resistance, causing elevated insulin, causing cancer. And then while I was writing my book, I was actually concerned and surprised in a way that new research came out, which actually showed cancers, certain cancers, colorectal cancer in particular, actually consuming the fructose directly and, seeming to sugar driving cancer, not through insulin, but directly. So that sort of interfered with my hypothesis, and I had to sort of reassess and make sense of that. And, Cantley and another scientist, Richard Johnson, have done really interesting work on that. Yes. Yeah, Richard Johnson's been on my show several times, and he's kind of a one-trick pony with some of the ideas that he has as well, but little malleable, a little more than Atkins and Warburg. So go back to what you disagree with Warburg about, because I want to hear what some of the things that you disagree about. Let's talk about those.
Okay, sure. So, the real question is, I think we all, everybody I'm talking about agrees that metabolism plays a role in cancer. So the question is how Warburg's hypothesis, again, was this, what I call the backup generator hypothesis. For whatever reason, respiration, that means burning, your nutrients with oxygen in the mitochondria. That's how most cells make energy, and that's the best way to make energy. It's very efficient. So if there's a switch to fermentation, if there's a switch to the backup generator, the assumption has to be there's something wrong going on, because the backup generator isn't supposed to kick on unless the main generator, respiration, is malfunctioning. And, you know, the first person to make this connection was Pasteur. It's called the Pasteur effect, that when, you know, one goes down, the other goes up. It's like a seesaw: respiration down, fermentation up. So that was Warburg's framework, and that's how he understood cancer. Something goes wrong with respiration, fermentation turns on, and that sort of, you know, can't support a cell in a way, you know, for all its energy needs, and that explains the shift to cancer. And the other metabolic hypothesis, I would say, is not that the mitochondria are defective, not that they can't burn nutrients for energy, but rather that the mitochondria are sort of reprogrammed and are doing other things. And first and foremost, sort of taking some of the nutrients and shipping, you know, sort of reconfiguring them and using them for building blocks for daughter cells. So one model has, like, you know, broken or defective respiration. Another model has the mitochondria are needed for building blocks, for bioenergetics, because, you know, cancer, you have to make one out of two and four, and so on. You have to grow. You need a lot of building blocks, and the building blocks might be the crucial need more so than the energy that you can get from breaking, you know, the nutrients all the way down for ATP. So, you know, they're not mutually exclusive. You know, I don't think it may be, you know, one cancer, respiration is, you know, the mitochondria are needed for building blocks, and another cancer, the mitochondria are truly defective. But what was really striking to me is thinking about single-celled organisms and how they grow. And, you know, if one of my favorite little videos is by Craig Thompson, who is the president and CEO of Memorial Sloan Kettering, who is one of the most famous cancer doctors in the world. And he was one of the more mainstream scientists who put metabolism back on the map and showed that these cancer-causing genes that we think about as oncogenes actually control metabolism. But when he talks to students, he does this little thing I love. He shows a piece of bread. I don't know if you've ever seen this video. It's on YouTube, but he shows like mold growing on bread, and the headline is "Everybody's First Cancer Experiment." And what he shows is cancer behaves a lot like a microorganism. And Warburg said this too. Warburg said, you know, what we discovered is that the cancer cell behaves like a yeast. And, you know, what the yeast do is, or any microorganisms, they take up as much glucose as they can get, and they just multiply. When they run out of space, you see the mold shifting to another part of the bread. You know, it's like analogous to metastasis. They find more food somewhere else. So I think that what's really the fundamental takeaway for me was not that respiration was defective, but that when a cell gains the ability to overconsume glucose, to eat everything it wants, then it it causes damage, certainly, but it allows a different type of metabolism called proliferative metabolism. It switches on a program through genetic and epigenetic changes that allow a cancer cell to multiply. So in one model, you might say respiration defective, the backup energies. On the other model, you might say a cell suddenly is able to eat more than it ever should be able to, and now it has a new imagination of new things it can do. Sorry, that was a lot.
Hey, don't fascinate. I was enthralled by everything you were saying. And as you were talking, you mentioned earlier kind of the insulin connection to all of this. And I know insulin gets a lot of attention in your work. What part does inflammation play in this? Because I'm thinking about things that not just raise insulin, but also raise inflammation, which we know refined carbohydrates obviously do that. But even the vegetable oils and some of that, is some of that teased out within this discussion?
Yeah, it's, you know, I certainly come across that a lot in my reading. I find, you know, my short answer is that I don't know enough to really answer it. I guess my longer answer is that I think that a lot of the inflammation stuff I find compelling, but you know, I still need to see more research, more science to fully understand it. You know, it comes up a lot in the context of the obesity cancer connection, where is the inflammation, from the obesity a big part of that story? And there's certainly evidence that it is part of the story, but I'm more convinced by the evidence that it's the insulin driving the obesity and the cancer rather than the insulin driving the obesity and the obesity driving the cancer through inflammation.
Although I will make the argument, it's almost impossible to have high insulin and not high inflammation as well. So is it just the insulin, or is it a symbiotic connection with the inflammation that's causing all this effect, which ends up as cancer, heart disease, diabetes, obesity?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I did find, at least in the context of cancer, what I found convincing is that, hyperinsulinemia in the absence of obesity is associated with cancer, and obesity in the absence of hyperinsulinemia, which is possible, of course, but uncommon. That's getting back to that subcutaneous that we talked about. If you're medically healthy obese, you're not at higher risk for cancer. So it seems to be, to the extent that we can lump obesity with inflammation, it seems to be that that's not the heart of the story based on these studies. But I think the verdict is still out on some of these questions.
And now you have my wheels turning. Is it possible to have high inflammation but not high insulin?
I believe so, but that's out of my area of expertise as well.
To answer it, it's just that thought came in. If you have high, I see we have an inflammation expert on here, Dr. Will Cole. He wrote a book about inflammation called The Inflammation Spectrum. But like when inflammation is high, it seems that's the heart of most chronic disease. Not that I'm trying to dismiss the insulin connection, but is it the inflammation that then contributes along with the insulin? Anyway, it's a fascinating discussion.
It's fascinating, and I think that's exactly the right question. I think the way we have to think about all these things is, what's causal, what's not only causal, but what's the earliest cause in the chain. So, this gets back a little bit to our question: is cancer genetic or is it metabolic? And I do think the answer is both, but what I'm most interested in is the causal path. What's the first step in the chain? And that's why I'm so interested in diet and hyperinsulinemia. Not that I'm, dismissing the genetic transformation, but I'm interested in what's the first step in that causal chain.
Well, and from a preventative standpoint, as it relates to cancer, as you were mentioning earlier, your goal is prevention and not treatment. A low-carb diet's not going to kill anybody, despite what you've heard, guys. And you are on the Livin' La Vida low-carb show, so I'm a little biased, but...
Yeah.
But guys, go check out Ravenous, Otto Warburg, the Nazis, and the Search for the Cancer Diet Connection. And it's by that gentleman there, Sam Apple. Really fabulous book, Sam. Congratulations on this. I really think you've got another book in you someday when this one kind of runs its course and you're done kind of promoting. I would like you go into the history of vegetable oils, how they became so ubiquitous in our society, their inflammation connection, and all their relationship to health. That would be a great follow-up to this book. But just throw
I need about a year to recover from writing that book, but then,
brother, I wrote 7 books in 7 years. I understand.
That's incredible, actually.
Yeah.
Now I mean, and I want to, but before this ends, just to say that, I know that, jokingly on Twitter called you the OG of low carb, but I really think you deserve a lot of credit for being early to the story. You were, into it before it was cool. So I really appreciate all you've done to, sort of communicate this stuff.
Thank you. I had Gary on a few months ago with his new book, The Case for Keto, and we were just like two old farts. Just remember the good old days when people hated keto and low carb and before. So
it's pretty amazing. What year did you start? Sorry, I'm a journalist. I always start asking questions myself.
You can interview me now, brother. So 2004, I did the Atkins diet, and then I started blogging 2005, podcasting 2006, the year before, or 2 years before the iPhone came out. I was podcasting, so.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I'm sure you've changed a lot of people's lives. It's pretty remarkable.
It's been a blessing, man. I don't take for granted. I'm just some schlub that has a country hick sounding voice that likes to talk to people. And, hey, energy and enthusiasm goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, keep your energy enthusiasm up. And again, guys, go get Ravenous. I think you'll be really pleased by the historicalness. And guys, unlike Gary, don't tell Gary Taubes. Gary writes a little nerdy. I love the nerdy, but dude, your writing style is so engaging. It just draws you in. And as a writer, I admire good writing. And so well done. You're going to love the read, guys. Go get Ravenous, available on Amazon, wherever books are sold. And Sam, go follow him at Sam Apple Books over here on Instagram. Thank you so much for being here today.
Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Get inspiration from the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. Hey, the livinglowcarbshow.com. Woo!
Keto Chow is a customizable shake mix that is also perfect for cooking and baking, giving you simple, nutritionally perfect meal options. Keto Chow. Make keto easy. Discover your favorite flavor at jimmylovesketochow.com.